Okay, class, welcome to the approaches and slash perspectives in psychology presentation. Where you should take the majority of these notes is on the white chart that was handed out in class. I would suggest you take very detailed notes. This is a topic that we will be talking about for the remainder of the year. So it is titled Perspectives in Psychology. Oftentimes it could also known as the approaches to psychology. A lot of the following perspectives are psychologists attempt to explain and predict behavior in the mental process. A lot of psychologists don't want to pinpoint one perspective way on how to describe somebody's behavior. Like it's purely the brain's fault for the reason why somebody's behaving this way. It might also be the behavior of the individual. So this is what it's looking at more in depth. I will talk about in class. It all started with structuralism and functionalism. Those are the two big known as schools of thought. Schools of thought were essentially perspectives. They weren't little houses or places that we go on a daily basis. It's like a school of thought was like a big idea that many people followed. Today, again, it is known as approaches or perspectives in psychology. Most of this information is found in your Myers textbook on page 8 and 11, and there is a great chart on page 11 as well. Again, I really want you to fill in the charts that I handed out in class. Psychology for a long time has been on this big debate over, is it nature's fault or is it nurture's fault? It really caused the individual to act a certain way. So controversy over whether human traits and behaviors are based on biology. So the reason why, let's say, Miss Gavin got depression was it because of something that is in her brain chemistry, hence why she maybe has a sad attitude? Or is it more based on she grew up in a really, let's say, a household that was pretty violent and sad, and there was a lot of money, and it was very impoverished? Is that the reason why maybe Miss Gavin is her cause for depression? Some of the big topics you can look at with nurture versus nature is what causes depression. Intelligence is something that you're born. It's the nature in which you're born with a lot of genes that allow you to be smart, or is it something more nurtured? Your parents are reading to you when you were young, you've gone to excellent schools, and hence that's why maybe you're so intelligent. People question serial killers. Serial killers, is it something that they're born with, the genes, they have this bad gene that's going to cause them to be really violent and negative? Or do they grow up in households, again, that their parents were serial killers, or they watched a lot of violent shows that cause them to be that way? And another topic you can talk about is personality, and the list can go on and on and on. So many psychologists nowadays take on the eclectic approach. Most psychologists today use this approach when they're describing different behaviors. It is a vocab term you do need to know. It's using more than one, if you want to call it, approach, perspective, or branch to explain certain people's behavior. They don't just blame it on the biological approaches they're acting this way. A lot of psychologists say, yeah, some of it might be influenced by your biology, but others might say, hey, it has to do something with your thought process, and I think it also is the neighborhood in which you grew up in. So, that we're going to look at these, it's known as the biopsychosocial approach, and we're going to come back to that. Some of it might have to do with your biology, and I would highly recommend you copy this chart down somewhere. I know there's not a ton of room on the paper that I gave you, but maybe make sure it is in your notes. The biological perspective is something that maybe it's your genes, you're genetically predisposed to this. We're going to talk a little bit about natural selection. It could be more on the psychological, and psychological has to do with mostly your thought process, maybe your emotional response to something, your cognitive response to something. And then you have your last one, which is sociocultural perspective. This is your family, your friends, and how they've influenced your behavior. And again, we will come back to this chart, but make sure you have it copied down somewhere. So breaking apart the biopsychosocial approach, there are 3 different approaches that we will go through. First approach, the neurobiological perspective, otherwise known as the biological perspective. I would make sure maybe this entire cross your your chart, where you're going to fill in the biological perspective right under approach. And make sure you maybe shade this area in yellow. That'll help you kind of remember which approach falls under the biopsychosocial model as we go through them in the remainder of the year. But what this approach basically looks at is more the nature perspective. It tries to seek links between the events in the brain and the mental process. What particularly is going on in this brain here and it's causing your behavior. Well, let's say if you got hit in the back of the head here, and we'll talk more in detail in this on class, but if you got hit in the back of the head here, and all of a sudden you're having issues seeing, well, clearly that's where your occipital lobe, that's where your sight is processed. It looks at things such as your nervous system, hormones, your genes, and it looks at, like I said, in depth in the brain. And your key words or key terms column, I would make sure you get to know and familiarize yourself with these terms that link with each approach. This one, neurons, okay, brain, and the nervous system are some big key terms that maybe you are familiarizing yourself with. And then people, we will talk about very, very popular person when we get to brain research with somebody who has done a lot of research on the brain. The person or another, I would say, approach at this point in time we're going to talk about is the evolutionary perspective, and you've probably heard about evolutionary perspective when you were little, studying science classes. This is nothing new. Charles Darwin, okay. They focus on factors such as natural selection, adaptation, and evolution of behavioral patterns. Some behavioral patterns maybe have been passed down generation to generation to keep those people alive. It takes into consideration both genetic and environmental factors. Behaviors that cause positive things to happen are repeated, and we develop genes from them. So we will talk a little bit about that. Key figures you need to know is Charles Darwin. And then again, keywords you want to add in your chart is survival, adapt, natural selection. Again, I would, in this column, cross it. When you're writing this in, I would maybe take a highlighter and highlight this whole section yellow. So again, you can remember that this has something to do with the biological perspective. It's looking at your genes, it's looking at particularly your body, how that's affecting your behavior. Then the last one under the bio section would be behavioral genetics, and this is a more current approach to psychology. This one is looking at your genes. Focuses on how our genes and the environment influence our individual differences. So what genes have been passed down, particularly from my family line, that are going to impact my behavior, my attitude, my personality. Some things to look at is they're looking at heredity and genetic predisposition. They're looking at keywords you should consider here on genes. So the question maybe to consider is, how is behavioral genetics different from the biological or neurobiological perspective, the first one we wrote down? Well, this one's looking at more particularly the genes. The neurobiological perspective, also called the biological perspective, is looking particularly just at the brain. Okay, this one's looking at specifically the genes. So those are all the biological perspectives. Moving on to things